Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, a physician with a respectable facade, became one of the most notorious figures in Victorian London's dark history. Under the guise of providing medical care, he secretly dispensed deadly doses of strychnine, preying on vulnerable women, using his sinister charm and cunning to both administer poison and run from the effects. For years, Cream operated in the shadows, his victims spanning across countries, borders and seas, until his insatiable thirst for power and cruelty ultimately revealed the monster behind the doctor's mask. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark History Season 8, Episode 23. I'm Ben, your host as always. Before we start, I've got a couple of notices that I just want to mention. The first one's not so nice. The second one's fun. So I guess I'll get them out of the way in that order. Sad news this week that Howard Hughes passed away. I don't know, obviously not everyone is going to know who Howard Hughes is, but he made a podcast called The Unexplained with Howard Hughes. Before that, he was a broadcaster reporting on like fringe sort of, The Unexplained. It's been around for years, like literally decades. And he was an amazing broadcaster, and he was truly a broadcaster as well. He loved audio, and he loved the audio medium and broadcasting. He collected like vintage microphones, and he always talked about broadcasting and just all the audio medium really on his podcast. And I loved his podcast. Long before I started Dark Histories, I used to work as a carer for a guy with multiple sclerosis, and it was quite long shifts. And I used to listen to The Unexplained when I get home, just to just relax, because his voice was so calm, and the way he spoke to his listeners, I just really loved. And he always approached, obviously, the topics were the same sort of fringe sort of topics. And he always approached the subjects and his guests with this kind of like curiosity and respect, but a certain degree of rationalism as well, which I think is in short supply in that sort of sphere. And he was just an excellent broadcaster, really. And it is a real shame. I feel like he's like one of the last of the kind of true sort of Fortean broadcasters. He had that Fortean philosophy of sort of curiosity and respect, but not just jumping in at the deep end and just taking everything for granted. So he was great anyway. If you haven't ever heard his podcast, their back catalogue is huge, like years and years and years of podcasts. It's called The Unexplained with Howard Hughes. It's unexplained.tv is their website. So if you are interested and you don't know it, then go check it out. Obviously very sad news about Howard. It'd be a real shame. He's one of the only podcast I've ever written an email to, in a non-professional capacity anyway. Because I just listened to his show and I just wanted to thank him, because to be completely frank, if it wasn't for Howard Hughes, I don't think Dark Histories would exist, and certainly not. I was very heavily influenced by him and the way he approached podcasting. He'd be really missed, and it's a real shame. So, rest in peace, Howard Hughes, I guess. In other news, more happy news, second thing, it's coming up to Christmas. So if you've listened to the show for a while, Christmas, I like to do the Christmas campfire episode. So if you have a story that you would like to send in, essentially what I'm looking for is any sort of strange or unusual experience you may have had in your life that you want to write about. Write in and let me know, and I'll read it out over Christmas. It's pretty much one of my favourite episodes of the year. It's really enjoyable. I love like the whole kind of tradition of Christmas and reading weird stories. So if you have a story, let me know. If you're not sure, there's the old Christmas campfire episodes in the back catalogue if you want to go listen to them and check out what they're all about. If you are interested, do send in your stories. I've had a few already. Sometimes I get them all throughout the year, actually. But I have noticed I've had a couple in the last couple of weeks come through. So I thought, as we come to the end of the season, I should probably start sort of the shout out for that. So if you are interested in taking part this year, contact@darkhistories.com. Send your stories in and I'll get them read out. Thank you very much. I really look forward to that. It'll be good fun. And it's always a really enjoyable sort of communal episode. And for me, it's like a great way to sort of connect with you. And I just love it. So yeah, do take part if you're interested. Anyway, those are the two little call outs I wanted to do before the episode starts. Let's go on, because it's quite a long episode. It's actually a two-parter. I rarely do two-parters. Don't really like doing it. Don't worry, it doesn't finish on a cliff edge or anything. So, cliffhanger rather. So, that they work as it works as two parts. But I was basically faced with the prospect of crushing this down to one episode or doing it justice and making it into two. So I sort of thought I'd go with that. I think the last two-parter I did was Jeff, which actually, weirdly enough, was this time last year. But yeah, anyway, with that said, let's get on with it. This is The Murderous Life of Dr. Thomas Neill Cream. Derived from the seeds and the bark of the Strychnos nux vomica tree, native to India and South Asia, the toxic substance of strychnine has been used in medicine for well over 1,000 years. From its earliest discovery, the highly potent properties were recognised almost immediately. However, much like in later years, it was still used in small, controlled quantities to treat a variety of illnesses, from digestive issues to snake bites, and as a stimulant for those more risk-averse. Truly coming into its golden age in the 19th century, it was after two French chemists isolated the poison as a pure substance in 1818 that the modern medicinal use of strychnine really took off. Throughout the Victorian period, doctors and pharmacists used the bitter crystalline alkaloid in all sorts of medicines. On one end of the scale, it was added to more conventional medicines like cardiac and muscular stimulants in order to boost their effects. On the other end of the scale, it was used as a rodent poison for pest control. In the latter years of the 19th century, it became a popular drug used as an athletic performance enhancer and was frequently used as a recreational drug added to morphine and opium. It was simultaneously seen as both a grand tonic for the ages and a savage murderous weapon when used in the wrong hands. A neurotoxin that attacks the central nervous system, strychnine can be fatal in relatively small doses, with victims of the poison quickly falling sick after ingestion. Agitation and stiffness are the first symptoms to develop, with muscle spasms, painful convulsions, vomiting and seizures developing shortly after. As the poison progresses through the system, lockjaw, bulging eyes, extreme sweating and a rapid heartbeat all work to terrify a victim before kidney failure, cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, brain damage, and general organ failure all work to rapidly shut down the victim's life. In high enough doses, a victim can experience the full gamut of symptoms, succumbing to the effects within 30 minutes. With no antidote, and with the only method of treatment being a mix of pumping the stomach, administering activated charcoal, and a large amount of crossing one's fingers, in general, the prognosis of a victim poisoned with strychnine is incredibly poor. Naturally, thanks to its highly aggressive properties, strychnine quickly became the weapon of choice for many Victorian poisoners, though its bitter taste often saw it overlooked for the easier to obtain, far more subtle poison of arsenic for many in the Victorian period. Nevertheless, strychnine remained a popular go-to for the more nefarious. One of the most infamous cases of a murder using strychnine was the case of the Brighton chocolate cream killer in the early 1870s that saw Christiana Edmonds poison and distribute chocolates around the city in an attempt to murder her lover's wife and cover her tracks in the process. 10 years later, however, a new proponent for strychnine was out walking the streets, and though his targets were quite different, the intended outcome was just the same. Born in the parish of Barony, on what was the rural outskirts of Glasgow, Scotland in 1850, Thomas Neill Cream's early life was fairly quiet and unassuming. His father was working as a bill collector for the Glasgow Gaslight Company for 4 years before the whole family decided to up sticks and move across the Atlantic to start a bold new chapter in Canada. At the time, Canada was the main emigration colony for British citizens, thanks in no small part to the favourable deals offered by the British and Canadian governments, offering farmers large swathes of land at incredibly favourable prices. This was just part of several schemes set up to aid in the recruitment of an active workforce, with the Canadian government targeting all manner of roles, frequently advertised in the pages of British newspapers, from shipbuilders to housemaids, and producing immigration manuals for those that might be interested to help them plan and make the move. For William Cream, with his Irish roots, there was also the added pull of a large Irish and Scottish communities already well established in several of the large cities that worked to smooth transitions and offered many opportunities for employment. When the Creams moved to Canada in 1854, they settled in the former French colonised city of Quebec, whose population of 50,000 had seen a dramatic shift in demographics over the past century, with its citizenry now made up of nearly 40% British immigrants. In 1854, the city was a thriving port, with its own shipbuilding industry that exported timber and completed ships to Britain wholesale, and had been driving the growing economy for decades, which now made it one of the foremost ports on the entire North American continent. Unsurprisingly, William Cream took a job as a clerk in a large, wealthy timber and shipyard, and eventually rose to the position of manager, where he oversaw the entire site's business. Thanks to this, the family lived in a nice house, paid for by his company, and Thomas attended a school also set up by the company for the children of its workers. Over the next decade, the Cream family prospered, and William rose to a comfortable position in society, active in the local Presbyterian church and bankrolling several philanthropic projects around the city. When they had moved to Canada, Thomas was one of 3 children, and though the mortality rate for children was astronomically high, and he had lost several young brothers and sisters already, he was now one of 6 Cream children, all looked after by a live-in housemaid. They had a staunch religious home life, and Thomas took to it willingly, attending Sunday school from a young age and eventually teaching there himself throughout his teenage years. It wasn't until Thomas reached the age of 19 before disaster truly struck the family. Having left school and taken a position as a clerk at the Baldwin shipyard, where he was seen as both a good worker and a good Christian, life was progressing fairly smoothly for the young man, when his mother suddenly died in 1870 due to complications arising during childbirth. It was the start of a bad year for the Creams, and a few months later, one of the largest shipyards in the city burnt down, taking a huge portion of the local economy with it. It was a blow to the already struggling shipbuilding industry that had slowly been in decline for several years. William Cream had shown his salt already by seeing the impending difficulties coming and diversifying his money into other sectors like banking and investment. But for the young Thomas Neill Cream, he was now faced with a career ahead of him that suddenly looked a lot less bright than it had even half a dozen years earlier. His answer was to leave the industry entirely, and thanks to his father's connections, he took a position a year later in the Presbyterian Le Chute Academy on the outskirts of Montreal. A relatively progressive academy, the school took in graduates from standard education and offered classes ranging from Latin, Greek and philosophy to mathematics and chemistry. For Thomas, it was a big step to move away from his family, but he thrived in the somewhat strict environment where he boarded with a teacher and was known throughout the school as an industrious and kind-hearted student. It was likely, during his year at Le Chute Academy, that he first had designs on a career in medicine, and a year later, after graduating, he enrolled in Canada's first medical school at the McGill University in the centre of Montreal, not far from the banks of the St. Lawrence River. Founded 43 years earlier, in 1829, and with links back to an even earlier medical school, McGill University had a strong reputation early on for its medical training. But with the epicentre of modern medicine over 3,000 miles away in Edinburgh, it had begun to fall behind by the time that Thomas Cream enrolled. Cadavers were notoriously difficult to come by, and so students learned mainly from textbooks, at least until a body snatcher, one frequently enrolled at the university as a student, could procure a dissection subject for a practical demonstration. More modern innovations like anaesthesia and germ theory had also been slow to travel to the curriculum, so any practical that did take place was in dirty conditions, with blood-soaked sawdust scattered on the floor and stained instruments. Still, it was a good education for a doctor at the time, especially when there were so many unlicensed practitioners around, cobbling together remedies to hawk in newspapers, offering to solve all manner of life's ills for a bargain fee. Rather than snake oil, Cream learnt to mix and combine industry-standard medicines from various ingredients, as well as those somewhat more exotic. Throughout his university years, Cream thrived. He lived in a small room, lodging with a music teacher, and took up the most gentlemanly practice of smoking a pipe. He also grew a moustache, fitting of any prominent doctor, and began flaunting his family's wealth, like any good medical student should. One of the predominant impressions he left his classmates with was one of unnecessary opulence and crass symbols of wealth. He would rarely be seen around town without his top hat, and was known to have adorned a fur coat at times. In fairness to Cream, he had worked hard to spend his money, and he had returned home to Quebec every summer break in order to work for his father and earn enough money to keep him in alcohol, pipe tobacco and smoked meats. On one trip home, he was surprised to discover that his father had finally chosen to remarry, this time to a far younger wife, who Thomas didn't much care for. 4 years after his enrolment, he graduated from McGill with his medical degree, having written a thesis in his final year about the chemical substance of chloroform, which had grown widely accepted as a prime candidate for a functional anaesthetic for labour pains by the Scottish physician Sir James Young Simpson in 1847. This was an area that would play a large part in Cream's later medical career. For now, however, Thomas Neill Cream had the world at his feet. Shortly before graduating, he had met a young woman named Flora Brooks, the daughter of a wealthy businessman and hotel owner from Waterloo, 400 miles to the southeast of Montreal. She had been in the city visiting friends when she had drawn the young medical student's eye, and before long the two were courting in the very Victorian sense. During his final few months at McGill, Cream visited Flora frequently, and now he planned to move to Waterloo so the two could get engaged and then married. When he left his apartment, ready to leave his home of the last 4 years for the last time, he asked his landlady if he could collect his belongings in a few weeks after he had settled somewhere else. The landlady had no issue with this in principle, but unfortunately Cream would never have the opportunity. A few days after he left, a fire started in the room, burning everything inside, including a medical skeleton that had mysteriously been left in Cream's old bed. Cream claimed for losses of $1,000 with his insurers, but after they had seen the report from the fire department and grew suspicious of arson, they refused to pay. Cream then threatened legal action, and eventually he received a settlement for $350. All told, it was a somewhat unsatisfying departure from Montreal. In truth, the fire was the last of Cream's problems. His wife-to-be had been suffering from a mysterious illness, and when the doctors were called in, the diagnosis was one of a botched abortion. Naturally, thanks to his medical background and close ties to Flora, the suspicion immediately fell onto Cream, and within 2 days, Flora's father had him sit down in a room alongside his lawyers to write up a marriage contract with his daughter. Unable to go to the police to report the abortion due to the damage it would cause to his and Flora's reputation in the small town of Waterloo, he instead locked Cream into a marriage to Flora, whereby he was fit to benefit from absolutely nothing of the family estate. Even stricter was the line drawn up on children. If Flora and Cream were to have any children, and Cream was to later leave the marriage, he would be on the hook for $10,000, an astronomical sum at the time for all but the very richest. Cream signed the agreement and then married Flora later that evening under the watchful gaze of Mr. Brooks. The very next day, Cream left for England, telling Flora that he intended to further his medical education in London. Never fear, he assured her, for he would soon return and they would be together again. Unfortunately, the reunion was never to be. Months later, Flora once more fell sick to the point of being bedridden. Her symptoms were vague, but described at one point as leaving her almost like an imbecile. When the doctor asked her if she'd been taking any medicine to help her recover from her botched abortion, she admitted that she had been, that she had taken some pills given to her by her husband before he had left for England. The doctor ordered her to stop taking them immediately, which she did and even made some degree of improvement, before she keeled over and died on the 12th of August 1877. Officially, her death was chalked up to the rather vague diagnosis of lingering illness. There were some rumours of tuberculosis, but nothing was ever confirmed. She was buried in the Waterloo Cemetery, and her entire estate was left to her father. When Cream found this out, he wrote a letter to Mr. Brooks demanding $1,000 for himself, but was once more forced to settle for a much smaller sum, and this time he received $200. It was money that would go a long way for Cream, who had been living it up in London the whole time his wife had slowly died, completely at a loss as to what had been wrong with her. Thomas Neill Cream had left Canada in September of 1876 and arrived in England a month later, in October, lodging in a room in Lambeth, London, just across the river from Big Ben. His new school was St Thomas's Hospital, a newly built teaching hospital with roots all the way back to the 12th century, where it was originally founded by a community of Catholic priests in order to treat the poorest of London society. Staying true to its original goals, the hospital still treated the many poor that made up the homes of the crowded and filthy streets of East London, with the sprawling site housing 600 beds. Compared to McGill University, it was at the forefront of medical advancements and exposed Cream to a different world of medicine, one where infectious diseases were far better understood and specialist departments ranged from dentistry to electrical therapy. At the end of the century, the hospital demonstrated the first ever use of an X-ray machine in London. Despite all this cutting-edge medical advancements that had taken place during the 19th century, Cream had decided to specialise in obstetrics, an area of medicine that had barely shifted for several hundred years, outside the introduction of anaesthesia in 1847. Cream's plan in England went deeper than just a stint at a medical teaching hospital, though, and he held lofty ambitions, hoping to pass the exams needed in order to become a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, a prestigious qualification that would have stood him head and shoulders above the multitude of unqualified quack doctors that advertised their wares in the newspapers back home in Canada. Unfortunately for Cream, actually passing the exams required a great deal of knowledge and hard work, and that was an area that had slipped a great deal since his graduation from McGill. In a new country, far away from home and perched on the edge of a London well known for its sordid nightlife, Cream was happy to indulge. He also had a new love interest to take his mind away from his work, and a relationship with his landlady's young daughter was blossoming quite nicely until she discovered from some Canadian contacts that Cream was already married. In a desperate move, Cream threatened to sue her friends for libel, which did absolutely nothing to further the bond between the two, as apparently no one had told him that threatening legal action on one's friends was a fairly poor pick-up line. Nevertheless, Cream continued his education and, finally, in April of 1877, he sat the exams for the Royal College of Surgeons. This was a tough ask at the time, with a pass rate that locked out all but the very top students, and predictably, Cream failed. 3 months later, he wrapped up his training at St Thomas's, and a month after that, his wife, who had apparently proved to be little more than an inconvenience to Cream, passed away back in her home in Waterloo. A year after his first effort, Cream made his way to Edinburgh to take the exams for the Royal College of Surgeons and Physicians of Edinburgh. No less prestigious than the Royal College of Surgeons in England, the exam was sat over multiple days, with joint exams covering both surgeons and physicians. This time he succeeded. With little else to do in England and no wife to tie him down to Waterloo anymore, Cream left and headed for North America, where he hoped his new titles could set him up in a comfortable position, carving out a living as a physician in any number of towns with no qualified doctor. Sailing from Liverpool to New York, Thomas Neill Cream first made his way to Des Moines, but he didn't stay there long, finding the town not to his liking. Crossing over the border, he headed next for the town of London in Ontario. With a population of around 20,000, London, Ontario was a relatively new city, having only been founded in 1826. Already it had transformed from a muddy settlement to an industrial and merchant hub, thanks to its inclusion as a gateway for the Great Western Railway. The city was the perfect place for a new doctor to build a strong clientele. Maybe he just found it more familiar than Des Moines, being a Canadian town with many names taken wholesale from its English namesake, including Blackfriars, Chelsea and Ealing. But this time he settled much more quickly, taking a room in a lodging house on an expensive suburban street and opening a doctor's office above a livery stable, where he advertised in the local newspaper. Ingratiating himself with the religious community, Cream was an active member of the church, and once again took up the role of Sunday school teacher, though despite his generally well-advancing reputation, he was known to not exactly practice what he was preaching, and many saw him drinking heavily at night. Things were set to get a lot worse for Cream, however, and quite quickly. On the cold, frost-bitten morning of Saturday, May the 1st, 1879, Jessie Bennett, the daughter of the owners of Bennett's Fancy Store, a relatively upscale general goods store selling fashionable ladies' items such as gloves, parasols and handkerchiefs, as well as day-to-day items like toothbrushes and sewing equipment, was walking around to the outhouse at the back of the shop. When she arrived at the small, ramshackled privy, she creaked open the wooden door and found herself face to face with a young woman in a purple dress, slumped against the wall, her straw hat lying on the ground at her feet. Stumbling backwards, Jessie ran back inside to alert her older brother, thinking that the woman had likely been a drunk that would need ejecting. Just as the pair were arriving, Constable William Ryder joined them and took control, touching the girl to see if he could detect breathing or a pulse. The absence of both quickly confirmed the worst. Her hands were lying by her sides, and in one she was holding a handkerchief, and next to her was a small medicine bottle. Closing the door back up, they waited for the doctor to arrive, and when he did, he surveyed the scene and gave his own opinion. The bottle, he said, smelled unmistakably of the sickly sweet scent of chloroform. This was backed up by the blotchy red chemical burns present on her nose and cheeks, most likely burnt from the substance being pressed over her mouth by the handkerchief in her hand. As the doctor was making his conclusions, Thomas Neill Cream arrived on the scene, his office just next door and overlooking the courtyard below. Taking a look at the girl stooped in the privy, he quickly identified her as Kitty Gardner, telling the gathering that he had known her well, as she had been one of his patients. Kitty Gardner had grown up on a farm around 100 miles north of London and had, until very recently, been working in a hotel, though she had left just a week prior to her death, citing a long-suffering illness that had made her feel too weak to work. In truth, Cream confirmed that she had been pregnant. Both the policeman and the doctor looked at the poor unfortunate and concluded that she must have committed suicide, smothering herself with the chloroform next to her. Within hours, the city coroner, Dr. John Flock, had ordered an inquest and gathered a jury to the London hospital morgue, where the body had been moved to after the discovery. The doctor's autopsy results confirmed for the most part what had so far been accepted as fact, that she had been pregnant and that she had died from chloroform poisoning. However, he caused something of an upset when he suggested that she had been killed rather than committed suicide. The burns on her face, he believed, would simply not have been caused by someone attempting to poison themselves, due to the fact that the victim would likely have passed out and dropped the handkerchief from their face long before the chemical exposure would have caused any burns. Further, he didn't believe that there had been enough chloroform on the girl's handkerchief to have done the job in the first place. With these revelations, the inquest was adjourned until new evidence could be discovered. Unfortunately, that evidence was to prove to be fairly difficult to come by. 2 other London doctors backed up the initial claims concerning the chloroform, and several witnesses said they had seen her visiting Thomas Cream's office on Friday evening, but Cream himself had already admitted that she had been one of his patients. When the inquest resumed, however, a new story began to develop thanks to the testimony of Sarah Long, a hotel maid that had worked with Kitty Gardner before she had quit. Sarah told the court that the father of Kitty's child had lived out of the city, and that when she had visited Cream, she had requested an abortion. Cream, she said, had had a very different idea. Refusing to abort the pregnancy, instead he suggested that she return to work and sleep with one of the hotel's more esteemed guests, of which she could then accuse of being the baby's father. If she did this, Sarah told the inquest, Cream had said that he would agree to back up her claims, and the two would share in any money that they could extort from their victim. This was a fairly awkward testimony for Cream, who adamantly denied the accusations during his own statement. Instead, he insisted that he had not seen Kitty for several weeks, and that when she had come to see him for an abortion, she had offered to pay him $100, of which he had refused, telling her that he would not touch her for $1,000. Bursting into tears in his office, he then said that she had threatened to poison herself if he would not carry out the operation. 3 days later, a letter, apparently written by Kitty, that Cream had already handed over to the coroner, had been slipped under his door, once again offering to pay him well if he would make this all right. As for an alibi, Cream said he had been out all night on the Friday and had slept in his office until Saturday morning, when he had woken to see the commotion around the Bennetts' outhouse. When Kitty's brother and Sarah Long took a look at the letter, however, neither said it looked like Kitty's handwriting. With little else to go on, the jury ruled that Kitty Gardner had been poisoned by chloroform, but that the murder had been carried out by some person or persons unknown. Cream had managed to slip off the hook, to much relief, but the local press were not so quick to accept this verdict. Cream, they universally said, was the primary suspect, but with no motive or evidence, there was little that anyone could do. There were theories that Cream had agreed to an abortion and had accidentally killed her whilst he had been anaesthetising her with chloroform. In order to cover his tracks, they suggested, Cream had dumped her body in the nearby outhouse and covered it up to look like a suicide. The press seemed far more concerned with the case than the police, however, and with no more evidence arising, the already low-key investigation quickly stalled. For Cream, the damage had already been done. He stood no chance of building a career in London anymore, not with this behind him, leaving his reputation and trust in tatters. He shut up shop and took off, looking to start again south of the border. When Cream rolled up in Chicago in July of that year, he found a city rife with typhoid outbreaks and snake oil quacks. This landscape alone felt promising for the qualified doctor, but what made opportunities even more appealing was the saturation of prostitution in the city and the dire need for abortions. The operations were so common that they were being advertised in local papers, always under thinly veiled intimations, offering to help treat female irregularities or complaints incident to the female frame. Where Cream could stand out was once more with his qualifications, and he quickly set about establishing an office in the back room of a drugstore. Unsurprisingly, this less than fancy establishment didn't do as well as he had hoped, and he hopped around from one place to another for a few months before finally settling in a room above a barber shop. With very few patients and in desperate need of money, it comes as no surprise that Cream found himself drawn to breaking the law, along with all the other doctors and quacks of the city, by performing illegal abortions, in the hopes that he could bide some of his time to establish himself. Once again, however, events would soon make sure that would not happen. Trouble just seemed to find the fledgling doctor, no matter where he went. Elizabeth and George Green lived in a small lodging in a tenement on West Madison Street. It was August in Chicago and temperatures were beginning to rise. Upstairs, they had heard their neighbour, a young woman named Hattie Mack, a local midwife and nurse, leave late at night the day before, along with her 3 children. And ever since, a creeping stench had begun to emanate from the room upstairs. Concerned, George climbed up the fire escape, but found the door locked. So, calling it a day, he decided to go to the police at Westlake Police Station and ask them to investigate instead. When the officials arrived, the familiar smell of death was all too apparent, and so breaking down the door, they were not shocked to find the decomposing remains of a young woman alone on a bed. Elizabeth and George continued to be helpful to the police, telling them that the body was almost definitely the remains of a woman named Maryanne Faulkner, a Canadian woman who had moved in with Hattie Mack 10 days earlier and had been visited multiple times a day by a doctor named Thomas Neill Cream, who had recently set up in the local area. The police didn't have too much trouble locating Cream. He was found in his lodging room, and they escorted him to the station, where he freely told the police that he'd been seeing Maryanne in order to treat a case of dysentery. When they searched his office, they found 2 letters, one of which implicated him in something that looked to most to be fairly suspicious and seemed to implicate collusion with the midwife, Hattie Mack. "Dr. Cream, I'll not be home tonight. I've tried to see you. I got the key. I can't take the children home till she is moved. I have not told anyone else. Please let me see you as quick as you can. I am under great strain. I am at my sister's. H.M." Hattie Mack proved a simple task to track down, and they did find her at her sister's. But when police questioned her, she told them an entirely different story. She said that Cream had carried out an abortion on Maryanne, and that she had been trying to care for her in her flat. When the police approached Cream with this new story, he flipped it on its head and told his own, saying that it had not been him that had operated on Maryanne, but rather it had been Hattie Mack herself, and she had done a poor job botching it and causing an infection from her malpractice. She had then called him in, he said, in order to try and save the situation, but it had been much too late, and all he could do was administer painkillers and hope for the best. The inquest opened on the 23rd of August, and when Hattie Mack took the stand to testify, she gave another new story, this time complicating the case even further for the jury. Now she said that she had owed Cream money and that he had pressured her into allowing him to carry out the abortion in her bedroom, And then, after it had gone disastrously wrong, he'd forced her into looking after Maryanne in secret, telling her to lock her doors, not let anyone inside except himself, and to keep the woman's presence hidden from everyone. She did her best to look after the ailing woman, and had only ran away after Maryanne had died, causing her to panic. As expected, Cream didn't take the accusations lightly, and in his own testimony he retaliated, sticking to his amended story that Hattie had only called him in once she had nearly killed Maryanne by herself. Initially, he said, she had told him that Maryanne had suffered a miscarriage, but he had suspected it was an abortion all along. With nothing else that he could do, he had been visiting the flat in order to administer painkillers, with the hope he could at least make her comfortable until her inevitable death. When questioned why he didn't just file a death certificate, he said that being so new to Chicago, he had had no idea about the procedure, having only lost a single patient since arrival. The medical evidence gained from an autopsy was presented, showing that Maryanne had died of an infection caused by an abortion that had been performed using some sort of sharp instrument and had perforated her womb. The jury therefore found it a fairly easy task to rule her cause of death as murder due to an illegal abortion, but carried out by whom was a different question altogether. Instead, they chose to implicate both Thomas Neill Cream and Hattie Mack, leaving the courts to decide. Both were taken to prison to await their chance to defend themselves. Unfortunately for Cream, he was now finding that his reputation from London would not be confined in this era of free information and print media. Before long, the press were digging up his past in relation to the death of Kitty Gardner, following the lead of most Londoners that Cream was absolutely guilty. Cream hit back, speaking to the press and telling them that no educated doctor such as himself, an esteemed member of the Royal College of Surgeons, lest you forget, would have carried out an abortion with chloroform. Meanwhile, realising his situation looked fairly bleak, he called in the privilege of his wealth in order to secure the services of Alfred Samuel Trude, a British-American lawyer and one of Chicago's foremost legal operators, regarded in every way an expert in the courts and something of a dab hand in corruption to boot. And Trude would need to be good too, as Hattie Mack had turned state's evidence and agreed to stand as the principal witness in return for her own freedom. Meanwhile, the police had uncovered a pocketbook and jewellery that had belonged to Maryanne in Cream's office, which only asked further difficult questions. The trial began on the 15th of November 1880 in the Chicago Criminal Courthouse on Michigan Street, right next door to the county jail that had held Cream since his arrest in September. For such a normally low-key case, Cream had proven to be quite the draw, thanks to the press stirring up his history, and over 100 people crammed in to watch the events unfold as Judge Joseph Eaton Gray attempted to assemble a jury that would view the case without bias. The process took all day, once again thanks to the huge amount of press in the lead-up to the trial, most of which had ruled Cream a hanged man already. The following day, the trial began in earnest, and straight away Hattie Mack took to the stand, sticking to her story that Cream had pressured her into looking after Maryanne following his botched abortion. Following Hattie's damaging testimony, Theodore Bluthart, the doctor who had carried out the autopsy on Maryanne, gave his own medical evidence, and Trude stepped in to work his magic. Whilst the doctor confirmed to the court that Maryanne had been killed during an abortion, Trude had him concede that it had been the work of an ignorant and reckless person. Surely this was a description, he told the court, which didn't match the esteemed Dr. Cream, with so many letters after his name. Bluthart also admitted that in Chicago it was true that most abortions were seemingly carried out by women. For the most part, Trude lent heavily into a defence that depended solely on Cream's Edinburgh qualifications and the words of a handful of character witnesses, all of whom had nothing bad to say about the doctor. When Cream finally took the stand for himself, he stuck to his guns, saying that it was Hattie Mack that had killed Maryanne and he had done nothing but try to help the poor creature. He had received Maryanne's pocketbook and jewellery from Mack and was simply holding them for safekeeping, and then, emboldened by his stellar legal representation, he went on to accuse the police of coaching Mack in order to frame him. The jury stepped out at 3:30 p.m. and returned in less than an hour, passing the verdict to the judge of not guilty. The very next day, the police dropped the case against Hattie Mack too, and both suspects walked away completely free. Once again, however, the case against Cream had damaged his reputation, and though he tried to forge on, his patient pool simply dried up. He moved to a seedier side of Chicago and rented a new room from a widow named Mary McClellan, and soon after found himself engaged to be married once more with her young daughter, 28-year-old Lena McClellan. It was a roller coaster life that Cream was living, but the ride was far from over, and trouble was just around the corner once more. 3 months after his trial for murder in Chicago, Cream was still struggling to find work thanks to the battering that he had taken in the press in the weeks leading up to the trial and in the days following. The case of Maryanne Faulkner had gone nowhere following the release of Cream and Hattie Mack, and many were not impressed that the two principal suspects had walked away as clean as a whistle. He did manage to maintain some patience, however, and having moved to a less prestigious neighbourhood, he was able to muster a living dealing with the less educated, who either couldn't or didn't read, and the less wealthy, who, whether they could read or not, found their options when it came to their health very limited. Ellen Stack was a 25-year-old Irish maid working for a wealthy Chicago salesman who visited him late one night. Cream had prescribed her some medication and saw her on her way. Later that night, however, she woke up suffering from severe pains, convulsions and vomiting. Calling out for help, other members of her household came to aid her and called in a doctor, but by the time he had arrived, Ellen was dead. An autopsy was carried out with cause of death attributed to spasmodic colic, with no evidence of anything untoward or unusual despite her young age and lack of health problems. A few rumours flew around for a while that she had died from a botched abortion, but they were quickly quashed when the results for the mortuary proved that she had not been pregnant. Cream once again found himself being questioned by the police. People had seen Ellen visiting the doctor on the night of her death, but Cream said that she had simply come to him with the symptoms of smallpox, and he had only supplied her with harmless medication, certainly nothing that could have caused such a violent death. At the same time, he did ruminate on the idea that she may have been poisoned by his medication, fingering the druggist, Frank Pyatt, who had prepared all of his medicines for him. It was possible, he suggested to the police, that Frank or one of his assistants may have made a mistake. Unfortunately, he had none of the medicine he had prescribed to Ellen left, with which he could supply the police to take a sample and test. Not that the police were particularly interested anyway. With no evidence to suggest foul play, the investigation was quickly dropped. This didn't stop Cream looking to profit from the situation, however, and soon after his visit from the police, Cream drafted up a letter and sent it out to Frank Pyatt. I understand you were annoyed at my making a statement in regard to Ellen Stack's death. No offence was intended. I expect you will be arrested and held for Ellen Stack's death. She was poisoned and there is no doubt of it. The fact has been proved by experiment. I received this information this morning, and to show my friendly disposition towards you, I have written to give you the benefit of the information I received so that you can take any steps you may deem prudent in the matter. For God's sake, keep quiet and trust no one. My bitter experience taught me to be suspicious of everyone I meet. I am sorry for your sake things have turned as they have. It was a peculiar letter for Cream to have sent, but one thing was for sure, it sounded a fair way from showing a friendly disposition. If Pyatt had thought so too, he would have been proved right a few days later, when a second letter from Cream arrived on his doorstep. This time, Cream suggested that the strongest evidence against him was a medicine bottle that proved the contents contained poison. Fortunately for Pyatt, the bottle had gone missing, and only Cream knew where it was. Cream was willing to help him out in this matter, he said, with a desire to do you a friendly turn. It's almost guaranteed that this friendly turn suggested would have entailed money, and it seems Cream's struggling business had led him to some new, fairly dark places. Pyatt was not buying any of it, however. He was also quite sure that Ellen Stack had been poisoned, and as far as he was concerned, it was Cream who was the killer. Sarah Alice Montgomery was a 22-year-old waitress in a small diner in the Illinois Ioneer Infirmary, though at 3 months pregnant, she knew she would have to quit work soon. One Friday evening, she accepted that it was time, handed in her apron and requested her wages. On the way home, she stopped into a druggist with a prescription for a mixture of ergo. The druggist wasn't especially keen on making up the prescription, given the toxic nature of the medicine, but since it was not a particularly dangerous dose, he shrugged his shoulders and made it up, handing it over and moving on with his evening. It was, after all, a pretty harmless prescription, even though he knew what it was likely to be used for. Later that evening, at around 9 p.m, Sarah checked into the Sheldon House Hotel and took the key to room 43 from the receptionist, asking her for a glass and a tablespoon at the same time. Within an hour, she was dead. Having gone to her room, the hotel had fallen quiet for an hour before her screams of agony had filled the corridor outside. Writhing in pain and suffering severe convulsions, she had died a fairly aggressive death, and when the contents of her stomach were tested following an autopsy, it surprised no one that the grim fluid had killed a cat within moments, suggesting that there was something more than ergo in the medicine that she had received from the druggist. With all the information, the inquest into the girl's death was delayed whilst the ergo bottle could be tested, and sure enough, the results showed it to have contained strychnine. The druggist was questioned, of course, but he was convinced that he would not have made any mistake with the two ingredients. The jury ruled the girl's death to have been caused by strychnine poisoning, but all agreed that they had no idea how or why her death had occurred, nor who had caused it. With this ruling, the case quickly sat cold until it was forgotten completely. Meanwhile, back in Thomas Neill Cream's office, the doctor had been carrying out an affair with the wife of one of his patients suffering from epilepsy named Daniel Stott. Daniel Stott had moved to America from Canada following the failure of his business and had settled in Chicago, marrying a woman named Julia and settling well into the local community. Julia had frequently made the trips into Chicago to see Cream in order to collect her husband's medication, and soon one thing had led to another, and the two were in a complicated romantic situation. On the evening of the 11th of June, Julia came to collect the medication as usual, and then, at midnight, had caught a train back to Garden Prairie, a small village to the west of Chicago. 2 hours later, she stepped onto the platform and made her way home, arriving there to divvy up her husband's nighttime medication. Handing him 3 capsules and a tablespoon of liquid, Daniel Stott downed the bitter liquids and powders and then went to bed. His reaction to the poison was quick. He had woken, writhing in agony, and before he had any chance of understanding what was wrong, he was dead. His wife, Julia, told the coroner, Dr. Frank Whitman, that she believed he had most likely died of an epileptic fit, and the coroner agreed, especially given Daniel's somewhat more advanced age. The story of Daniel Stott might have ended there and then, had the coroner not received a letter a few days later accusing Daniel Stott of being poisoned. This letter was written by one Thomas Neill Cream. Over the following days, he received several more letters too. This time, Cream went into details, telling the coroner that Stott had died of strychnine poisoning, and that it was likely that the druggist had put too much of the poison inside the medicine bottle when he had prepared his medication. Bizarrely, he said that he had been tipped off to all of this after he had visited a fortune teller. Not surprisingly, the coroner didn't take any of it too seriously at first, but when the letters became more and more specific, he took it upon himself to give some of the medicine to a dog, and when it died shortly after, his attitude changed very quickly. The next day, he ordered an exhumation of Stott's body, and an inquest was opened in his office on the 14th of July. The druggist testified and confirmed that he was absolutely certain he had not filled the bottles incorrectly, thanks to the cautions set up whenever he dealt with lethal substances. Julia Stott gave her own testimony, where she said that she had possibly left the medicine bottles in Cream's possession while she wasn't in his presence, but that she was quite sure he had not tampered with the contents. When she found out about the letters written to Dr. Whitman, she wrapped up her testimony and then went to visit Cream, asking him if he believed she had dosed her husband incorrectly and killed him by mistake. It was now that Cream chose to divulge his plan. If Julia could give him power of attorney over her husband's affairs, he could sue the druggist for preparing the wrong drugs. Unfortunately for Cream, he'd badly misjudged the situation, and Julia wanted nothing to do with any of it. An arrest warrant was placed for Cream, but when the police visited his office, the doctor was long gone. Days later, at the beginning of August, in Windsor, Ontario, a man took a room in a lodging house, given the name Dr. Donald Ross. Sadly, for Donald Ross, he had no idea his letters were being intercepted, and when it became obvious that Ross was in fact Cream, the police barged into his room at 1 o'clock in the morning and arrested him for the murder of Daniel Stott. Protesting his innocence, Cream assured the police that he was not running with guilt, he was simply trying to lie low after the case got too hot back in Chicago and he had feared another press hanging. Tossed aboard a train, he was escorted 330 miles back to the town of Belvedere in Illinois, where he was tossed in prison to await his trial in September. Once again, the press went to town, calling Cream a noted abortionist in Chicago, with the public opinion heavily leaning into the guilt of both Cream and Stott's wife, Julia. By the time the trial opened on the morning of 19th of September in the Boone County Courthouse, once again the jury took a full day to assemble thanks to the heavy press coverage of the case. Once again, Cream also found himself being testified against by a suspect turning state's evidence, as Julia Stott took to the stand, this time with a new story. After informing the court that she had been having an affair with Cream, she then told them that Cream had personally taken her to the druggist to collect her husband's medication, and then, when the two returned to his office, she said she personally saw him handle the medications, though she stopped short of saying she saw him dose them with strychnine directly. She also repeated the story that Cream had been pressuring her to allow him to sue the druggist for a windfall. The witnesses kept coming too, and when Julia's 10-year-old daughter, Revel, stood to give evidence, it looked fairly bleak for Cream when she said that he had told her that he loved her mother and that he wanted her as his own. When they called on Cream's landlady, she told the court that Cream had actually told her one evening that he had the knowledge to mix a medicine that would kill Julia's husband in 20 minutes. The medical evidence presented the results of tests on the medicine bottle and showed that it had contained strychnine, as did the remains of Daniel Stott. If Cream had hoped for a strong defence, it never appeared, with the legal team arguing that Daniel Stott had most definitely been poisoned, but just not by Cream, laying the blame solely at the feet of Julia. During his own testimony, Cream said just as much directly when he told the court that she had asked him for strychnine in the past and that he had refused her. Somehow, he assumed, she had gotten hold of some of the poison anyway, and apparently she had actually shown him. He had written to the coroner to accuse Daniel of being poisoned and to press for an inquest to be held, not in order to blackmail anyone, he said, nor to lay up the grounds to sue against the druggist, but because he heavily suspected Julia had killed her husband. He stuck by this story, and everything else Julia was accusing him of, he said, was a complete fabrication. Following long, drawn-out summaries, the jury had a choice to make. Was Cream the guilty party, or was it the widow, Julia? When they left the court to make their deliberations, the press were unsure, seeing an acquittal highly likely. They were wrong. When the jury returned after 4 hours, they handed the judge a verdict of guilty, with the suggestion that Cream be held in prison for a life sentence. Whilst Cream was carted off to Illinois State Penitentiary on the 1st of November 1881, Julia Stott was released, and despite press and public opinion heavily against her, no investigation into her involvement was ever followed up. Cream spent the first 3 years of his sentence working hard labour, with 1 day a month in solitary confinement. In March of 1885, he applied to the governor of Illinois for a pardon on the grounds that new evidence would see him innocent, and that Julia Stott had committed perjury either during the inquest or at his trial. He had employed the lawyer that had represented Julia during the inquest to take on the task, which he did gladly, not least because he believed in Julia's guilt himself. The $5,000 sent to the prison for Cream's legal fees certainly helped matters too, for both the lawyer and the state's officials. Despite all the money, though, and a fairly strong collection of petitions and affidavits claiming that Julia had planned to kill her husband all along, Cream's application failed. Whilst in jail, Cream took the time to convert to Catholicism, and then, in 1887, his father died, leaving nothing of his estate to Cream. His father's death did come with a non-financial benefit, however, and when his father's friend, Thomas Davidson, began suggesting that William Cream had died, thanks in no small part due to the stresses of his son's arrest, he began seeking a new pardon, in a way of appeasement. He threw himself into the task of collecting as many character references as he could from many well-to-do supporters from good society, including several religious institutions. Meanwhile, Cream's brother, Daniel, was not so sure he wanted Cream released. He had been visiting Thomas in prison, making the round trip from Canada once a month, and it was his opinion that being locked up had done some funny things to his brother's head, stating that he thought he was becoming unhinged, though he still played his role in backing the petitions. Davidson just saw this as all the more motivation to have Cream released as soon as possible, and in July 1891, after he had served just under 10 years, Cream's sentence was relaxed to 17 years, meaning that thanks to his good behaviour, he could be released almost immediately. On 31st of July 1891, Cream walked out of the Illinois State Penitentiary a free man, with the rest of his life ahead of him. What he would choose to do with it was up to him, and Cream had a few ideas. So that was part 1 of the murderous life of Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, and we shall have a little chat about that after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So yes, the first part of Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, it splits quite nicely there. I kind of writ it like it was a bit of a cliff edge, but the story does split neatly into 2 halves. So, you're not kind of hanging on too much, I hope. Either way, I hope you did enjoy this story. It's Dr. Thomas Neill Cream is certainly a creature. He's one of the more unsavoury characters I think Dark Histories has written about, and that's saying something, I think. I probably won't dig into it too much this week because we'll go more into it at the end of next episode. But I guess a few things to just point out about this one. The money that his father gave was, for his pardon was really suspicious. They essentially tried to bribe him his way out. Basically, the whole of this episode, Cream, I think, really lent on his privilege throughout. He definitely saw his privilege as a way to remove him from situations that he perhaps, weren't advantageous for him. Interestingly, I think, he's a strange character in that in most cases he probably would have got away completely free if he just hadn't written letters, which I find that quite an interesting element of this case. The audacity he had to go down and see Kitty Gardner when she was found in the outhouse. I think if he'd not said anything, he probably would have got away completely scot-free. But instead, he had to go down there and say, "Oh yeah, Kitty Gardner, she's my patient." Yeah, it reminds me of those serial killers that write letters to the police to goad them on, to try and catch them. It just seems like he had that streak running through him. Otherwise, though, a completely unsavoury character. It's almost more so because he came from a very good background. He had no reason in his life to really flip and start doing these fairly unsavoury things. I mean, we could question some of these sort of accusations against him because obviously he was only found guilty for one. And even that one, I think you could probably levy a good argument to say that he was either not guilty or it wasn't just him. I think his explanation, for example, about Faulkner, the Faulkner murder, and it being Hattie Mack, I think that's actually quite plausible. The idea that it was her that did the abortion and botched it, and he was just trying to look after her, and that he had the pocketbook and that's for safekeeping. I don't think any of that stuff is. I'm not saying he didn't do it or he's not. He's an innocent man, but I think it's at least it's a plausible buy option, if you like. It was a plausible story by Cream. I think it's very telling as much how these stories seem to, bad luck seems to find him, or trouble seems to always find him. So I think it's more a case of he makes the trouble, right? It's that I think is the most telling element. I think if you took just one of these cases by itself and said, like, oh, he only did this one, I think you would probably be hard pressed to see him as a killer or whatever. But one after the other, these cases crop up, and you realise, this man just can't avoid trouble, can he? And when trouble keeps finding you, it's generally you that's finding the trouble, not the other way round. that was, say, the first part. I hope you enjoyed it. The second part will be in 2 weeks' time. Look forward to it. Until then, if you'd like to get in touch, contact@darkhistories.com is the email address. And as I mentioned in the start of the episode, if you're interested in taking part in the Christmas campfire episode, that's where you want to send that to as well. Otherwise, you can contact me, social media, Instagram, Facebook, stuff like that. It's all in the show notes, as well as on the website, which is darkhistories.com. And you can go there. You can also find links to things like merchandise and support if you would like to do so. Always greatly appreciated. I've got a Patreon with advert-free episodes, things like that, and a bunch of bonus content if you're interested. Otherwise, that's about that. So thank you very much for listening as always. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next episode, take care. Sleep tight.